Okay guys, this is overview of the console part 1. We're just going to talk about some of the surface basics for the 3500. Let's talk about input layers. As you'll see, we have what's a huge difference from the previous mixing console that we have is that there is not a fader for every single thing on the board like we used to have. So you're going to be immersed now in the reality of working on layers, which is really surprisingly easy to adjust, I think, with just a little bit of experience. So what we have done is we have laid out a console setup for you where we've put things in sensible locations to find all of your inputs on the faders. So for instance, on our first layer right now, we have all of our wireless, basically all of our vocal mics and wireless for worship team, including even the announce mic, which we're calling MC mic now, and the headsets 1 and 2. So those are on the first layer of inputs. On the second layer, we have our drums and our bass, our acoustic guitars, 2 of them, and our electric guitar spot. On our third layer, we have our pianos. So we have our piano left and right, and the synth 2 left and right, which is the synth module that is at the main piano station, and then also the original synth left and right, which is played on the Yamaha motif. We've got stereo tracks. We've got our click, which is not assigned to the house, of course. We've got our computer, and then we have 2 custom layers, which we'll talk about in another video about assigning layers. But we have D and E are layers that you can customize and put any channel in based on the type of service you're running. And on layer F, we've got the talkback mic, we've got our house mics, we've got our USB, which we'll talk about in another video, the ability to play audio from a USB stick inserted into the console. We've got our choir mics if we were doing a choir, baptism mic, and again, the computer. So that's an overview of the input section. You'll notice on this console that we have 2 sections of 2 banks of 12 faders each. And although you can route anything to any fader, technically you think of the left side of the console as being your inputs, your individual channels, instruments, and the right side of the console being relegated to outputs and DCAs and effects sends and returns. So that's how we have things currently set up. So I wanted to give you just a really quick idea of how that works. So on both banks, on both systems of faders, we have banks. So this is considered bank 1, and we have A, B, C, D, E, and F layers of inputs that can be completely customizable and moved around. And we have bank 2, which also has A, B, C, D, E, and F. And these are typically outputs again, although you can change that up to taste. So that's input layers. Let's talk about DCAs. DCAs are one of the things that make mixing so easy when you have more inputs than you have fingers to fade with. And so what we've done is similar to on the M7, we've created DCAs, digitally controlled amplifiers, that group multiple channels. So we have, on our first DCA, we have an all band, which is super helpful if you, let's say we're doing a worship element and the band is underscoring it, but there's some readers maybe reading and they're not reading as dynamic as someone singing. You're able to pull the band a little bit back. We have a DCA just for vocals, for all worship team vocals. Makes sense, right? We have a DCA for all of effects. So your reverb for the vocals, your reverb for the drums and band, and then delay. So any of those things are all grouped to this DCA to mix. We have a DCA for all drums, all percussion instruments. And then we have just moved the bass channel on its own over here. And again, the idea is that you could literally mix the whole service from this bank 2 position, only needing to tweak things occasionally. So you have the bass, we have the tracks, and again, tracks are left and right, but this DCA allows us to group it on one fader and still keep it in stereo. We've got the keys 1, which incorporates not only keys 1, but also the synth 2 that we are incorporating in that instrument, and then also the original synth on its own DCA. We've got both acoustic guitars on here. We've got the electric guitar, singular, so just an individual, and then we've got a DCA for all the leader mics, the headset 1 and 2, the MC mic, and then we've got the computer. And in all the other layers, you'll see that the main left and right output, which is currently muted right now because of the way I'm recording this video, but you'll see on most of those layers, main left-right output is here. Layer B, we've put the effects, which we're going to talk about much more in depth in another video. We've got the effects control, we've got the effects returns, right? How we mix the affected inputs back into our mix. And then on the C bank, we have it free for it to be customizable. Same thing with D. And then on our, and E for that matter, C, D, and E can be customizable for any combination of DCAs. I think what I'd like to do is just keep the first 2 layers here and the first 3 layers over here, just not change them. So we have a standard home base, and then just use the open layers to configure a mix for your own preferences. And on the very last layer, this is layer F of bank 2 on the right side of the console. We've got a couple of stereo mixes that we can send to in-ears, and I'll talk a little bit about that in another video. And we've got a choir monitor master aux send if we were using a choir monitor on stage. We've got the butt kickers for drums and bass. These are like the master output sends that we can send to these from individual channels. And we've got a flex channel, which is basically a grouping of the leader mics, the computer, things like that. And that is actually created so that on our in-ear monitoring on stage, on the personal mixers, we have just kind of a flex channel that covers all of those things. So this isn't primarily for mixing in the house. This is actually more for the personal monitoring. So we just basically leave it up. And then we've got 3 matrix outputs. Matrix outputs are a little different in the way that they derive the signals that they mix. And so we'll talk about that in just a second. But we've got 3 matrix outputs right now. One is to hit the MP3 recorder, which we're still using the standalone MP3 recorder. Even though there's an onboard USB recorder, we're choosing to continue to use our rack mount recorder. And the reason being is that, to the best of my understanding, you cannot change the resolution or the file type for the audio recordings. And so at the length of our services, they're like 3 gigabyte files. They're WAV files and uncompressed. And so using our MP3 recorder allows us to have a compressed file, which is much more manageable for the people who upload it to our podcast. So we've got an MP3 recorder output. We've got our video output. We've got our matrix feeding the lobby output. We have an aux send to the submasters, the subwoofers, and again, these don't typically change. They pretty much just stay at a 0 nominal position. And then, of course, another instance of our main left-right bus. So that tells you a little bit about the input layers, output layers, and the DCA layers. Now, here's another thing about the DCA, which is so cool, and this is a new feature for us. If we go back to our layer A on bank 2 here, you'll see all these DCAs that we have. And one of the things that's unique about learning digital mixing is having to start retraining your brain to look for things on different layers and having to memorize where things are in different layers. And sometimes in a panicky moment of mixing and a lot of things going on, it can be frustrating to have to dig and find things. So there's this new thing called DCA Spill. And basically what happens is we'll use the vocals, we'll use the keys as an example. So we're on the DCA for the keys, and this incorporates the piano left and right and synth 2 left and right. So instead of, let's say I'm mixing that level, but we decide that the synth 2 is a little bit too loud in contrast to the piano, and you want to change that. Well, instead of having to dig down to a layer to find it and adjust it, you can actually hit the mix button on that DCA, and look what happens on the left side. As we hit it, all of a sudden it reconfigures to showing just the channels that are part of that DCA. So it gives you a very fast way to mix it. And what we find here right now is that synth 2 left and right weren't even in that mix right now. So we're going to mix that to maybe half. So, and then as soon as you're done with that, you want to deselect mix to get back to a normal mixing to left and right faders. So that's a really quick way to mix the service to get to the things that are in the DCA, is by just simply hitting the mix button. And when you're done, it flashes to remind you that it's on. When you're done, deselect it. The only other thing on this first overview of the Surface is to talk about the Softkeys that we have, and these are programmable. And there's a couple of things that are going on here that I hope you can see. Starting at the top, we've got a talkback mic. This is the talkback mic, which is typically right here. I don't know if you can see it in the video. We've mounted it on a tripod now. And to talk, you just press it, and it will stay latched as long as that green light is on. You're on, so you want to remember to turn it off when you're done with it. We've got 3 sets of mute groups, and we'll probably be adding, even by the time you see this video, we may have added more mute groups. Here's an all drum mute group, guitars, and all vocals mute group. And while we're talking about mute groups, the way to customize those mute groups is to go to the mix rack. These are all buttons that pertain, these are layers that you can look at in your menu. So we're going to go to the mix rack layer. We're going to tab over here to mute groups, and now these are 8 mute groups that you can assign. And so we're going to mute group 1 is the drums, and as you can see, it's literally as simple as just selecting the things you want to go in that mute group. You want to change the guitar mute group, you can add, so the bass and guitars are in there. Let's say we wanted to add, a synth in there for some reason. That's how you do it right there. So that's how you adjust mute groups. And the last thing I would just inform you about is some of the remaining soft keys that we've programmed. You'll notice this one right here called left right. This is really just a safety indicator to make sure that you're mixing to the main speakers with your faders. As you know, when you get into send to faders mode, you can forget that you're in that mode, and you can be moving your faders thinking you're mixing to the house and nothing's changing. And so one of the safeties to know that you are mixing to the house is that if you see that blue light. So when you use the mix button to mix to an effects return or something like that, which again we're going to talk about in another video, but let's say I'm mixing to the vocal reverbs. The vocal reverb, all of the faders now are only mixing to that vocal reverb bus. And if I go to another layer, I can completely lose track of what mix button is listed right now. So the safety for me is to have this left and right button right here that allows me to get back into mixing to the main speakers. So that's the left right. The only other soft key we have programmed is at the very bottom of the strip, and you'll see it flashing, and that is a tap tempo button for using delays, which we typically use on our vocals. And so to use the vocal, you're wanting to actually tap on this button in the rhythm of the song in order to have the delay match rhythmically with the tempo that the band is playing. So that's an overview of the console part 1, just some very basics about the surface. We talked about input layers, we talked about DCA layers for mixing, we talked about mute groups and the soft keys that are here, even how to assign the mute groups, and in some other videos we're going to talk about actually modifying the surface, moving faders around for convenience. So check that out as well.